From 2019 to 2023, Capcom released 3 Resident Evil remakes. The remakes for Resident Evils 2 and 4 were smash hits, being praised by critics and die-hard Resident Evil fans for recreating the magic of the older games using modern technology. It would have been a near-perfect trilogy of remakes, however that would not be the case. In 2020, Capcom officially released the remake for Resident Evil 3. For the first time since 1999, players had the chance to play as STAR's agent Jill Valentine and her uphill battle against a near-indestructible bioweapon specifically designed to hunt her down. Before going any further, I want to make something clear. I personally did not play the original Resident Evil games, and just like how nostalgia doesn't play a factor in my love for the RE2 remake, the exact same thing applies to my dislike for the RE3 remake. I've seen plenty of people complaining about the clock tower getting cut out, and sure, that sounds like a valid complaint, but once again, I've never played the original, so it doesn't really matter to me. Also, it should be noted before we go any further, I don't think this game is absolutely terrible. RE3 does a lot of things very well, and I will try to give this game its due respect when it's owed, but especially when compared to the remakes of Resident Evils 2 and 4, RE3 is very obviously the weakest game in the trilogy. Today I'm going to review Resident Evil 3 and do a quick breakdown on the many problems with this game. And while this video is going to be mostly negative, I must admit, after doing 2 playthroughs on Hardcore and Nightmare mode, I have warmed up to this game a lot. RE3 at its core is a good video game. It's the structure around it that unfortunately drags it down. Without wasting any more time, let's review the Resident Evil 3 remake. The first massive problem with Resident Evil 3 is the pacing. This game is pretty much pedal to the metal for the first 15 minutes. At around the 5-minute mark, Nemesis breaks into Jill's apartment. A minute or so later, Jill escapes and meets up with Brad. About a minute later, Brad gets killed and we get our hands on a gun. And at around the 10-minute mark, Jill reaches the roof of the parking garage and has yet another encounter with Nemesis. This game does not waste any time throwing you headfirst into the action. And I know that a lot of players are going to like that, but there's also going to be the crowd of people who prefer build-up and suspense. In the case of RE3, I think it should have been somewhere in the middle. It's obvious that RE3 wanted to take a more action-based approach with its gameplay, but I personally think that Capcom went all out way too soon. I'm not saying that Nemesis should have been introduced at the 1 or 2 hour mark, but the opening 5 minutes does seem a little early. Also, I don't mean to nitpick, but you're telling me Nemesis can break through a concrete wall but can't break the door to Jill's apartment? Shortly after, Carlos gets introduced, and then we get the typical Resident Evil gameplay you would expect, solving puzzles and exploring the area for supplies. And this is easily the best part about Resident Evil 3, and it gets even better once Nemesis gets thrown in. During the build-up to this game, I was expecting Nemesis to basically be Mr. X 2.0, faster, stronger, and posing more of a threat to the player. And in the first act of Resident Evil 3, Nemesis is exactly that. Unlike Mr. X, Nemesis has more than enough mobility to keep up with Jill. Not only can he break into a full sprint, he can also drop out of the fucking sky. And on harder difficulties, it's easy to get caught up in the chaos and die if you're not careful. This is also a good place to highlight one of the best mechanics added to a Resident Evil game. Dodging in this game is not only fun, it's very rewarding, and getting them down is basically a requirement if you want to beat this game on harder difficulties. This mechanic also complements Nemesis beautifully, because if there was no dodging in this game, Nemesis would be a lot more frustrating to deal with. If you ADS right after landing a dodge, the game goes into slow-mo and immediately locks onto the enemies for you. Once again, it's a rewarding and fun mechanic. However, once you hit the sewers, the problems with this game become a lot more apparent. The first thing you'll notice in the sewer is the lack of exploration and backtracking. There's some of it, but compared to the first act, it's noticeably watered down. The sewers are also filled with enemies who can one-shot you. Scary at first until you get the grenade launcher. One flame round and these guys are dead, even on Nightmare mode. Once you get out of the sewers, there's a chase scene with Nemesis that leads to a boss fight on a rooftop, and this might be the best boss fight in the game. It's a really good fight, and definitely one of the highlights of the game in my opinion. Nemesis brings a flamethrower this time around, and if you're not landing your dodges, then you're gonna die very fast. Once you shoot the fuel tank enough, it eventually explodes. Instead of staying down, however, Nemesis uses his flamethrower as a club in one last attempt to take you down. Again, this fight is fucking awesome. If only all the Nemesis fights were this fun. We get a chase scene later on where Nemesis brings out the rocket launcher, but sadly he only brings it out during this chase, which only lasts a couple of minutes. Shortly after, the player then takes control of Carlos, who is assigned with locating a doctor with his squad mate Tyrell. The first segment with Carlos is literally just the RPD from Resident Evil 2. And sure, they use the opportunity to do some cool shit, like showing us how Marvin got bit and the hole in the shower wall. However, this segment does have a lot of problems. Carlos comes strapped with an assault rifle and a handgun, making even basic zombies an absolute pushover. It gets harder with Lickers and Hunters, but even on Nightmare mode, the segments with Carlos were noticeably easier than the segments with Jill. Once again, it's clear that Capcom wanted to take an action turn with this game, And while it is fun mowing down zombies with a fully automatic rifle, it becomes noticeably less engaging the further you get into the game. This segment is also surprisingly short. There's one puzzle involving yet another C4 detonator, and once you get to the STARS office, the Carlos segment is officially done. It should also be noted that most of the doors in the RPD are locked, putting you on a very linear path, once again, watering down the exploration. Though it should be noted that instead of dodging, Carlos just fucking punches the zombies, which is great. After Carlos is done at the RPD, the game goes back to Jill after Nemesis destroys the train. After walking a short distance, we have yet another boss fight with Nemesis. Except this time, Nemesis is way larger and moves in a much more animalistic way. This fight with Nemesis is not bad, however in my opinion it's not nearly as good as the fight on the rooftop. Overall, it's a solid boss fight, but this is the point in the game where almost everything gets noticeably worse. Let's finally do a deep dive into the main problems with Resident Evil 3. The first act of Resident Evil 3 is easily the best part of the game, because you're exploring and solving puzzles as you battle zombies for the small part of a city, and during the backtrack through the area, Nemesis gets thrown in and starts chasing you. Just like with Mr. X in the previous game, except this time he's on steroids. I already praised my love for the first hour and a half of this game, but every gameplay segment after this part is noticeably weaker for two reasons. 1. They're not nearly as large, and there is very little puzzle solving and backtracking. The lab in Act 3, for example, is so laughably linear. Like seriously, this is one of the worst third acts in a Resident Evil game. The pale heads go down in one shot from the Lightning Hawk, and it's a small area, which means a lot less exploration. And secondly, no Nemesis from Act 1 onwards, at least not in his bipedal form, which is one of the biggest personal gripes I have with this game. I voiced my love for Mr. X in the RE2 remake more than enough already, but Nemesis was supposed to be the upgraded version of that, and he was. I'm gonna reiterate this point one more time, he can literally drop out of the fucking sky. And if you're not good at dodges up to that point, then Nemesis is going to make sure you get good at it because outrunning him is not an option. This first area is great because it's large, there's puzzles, and there's a lot of backtracking, and on top of that, Nemesis is wandering the area trying to kill you. The areas that come after that are nowhere near as large, and the worst sin of all in my opinion, Nemesis from the train explosion onwards only shows up in scripted boss fights. Those boss fights are not all bad. Okay, the last one does kinda suck. It's literally just shooting glowing spots on a meat wall and then fire the railgun twice to end it. Though I must admit, this is fucking badass.
Next time, take the fucking hit!
Overall point is, the sewer, the warehouse, the hospital, and the lab are all noticeably weaker areas than the city because they are much smaller, a lot more linear, and no Nemesis wandering the area. Another massive problem with this game is the lack of replayability. RE2 gave us two playable characters with two separate campaigns, each with their own unique weapons, and while their stories basically overlap each other, there are a lot of differences between the two campaigns. There's also a second run mode which gives you even more new weapons and switches up the enemy placement. And finally, if you're looking to punish yourself, there's the Ghost Survivor game mode. Resident Evil 3 has two playable characters stuffed into the same campaign. There is no mercenaries, there is no Ghost Survivor game mode. There is a shop where you can unlock weapons and outfits, but still, compared to RE2, it's honestly kind of laughable. The only thing in this game that will warrant players to go on a second run is turning up the difficulty and trying out new weapons from the shop. And trust me, you will get bored of that very fast. The core gameplay in RE3 is actually really good. Shooting feels enhanced from Resident Evil 2, and once again, the dodges in this game are really fun to pull off. This is also a good time to mention another thing about Resident Evil 3, Inferno mode. I won't talk about it long because I spent maybe 40 minutes playing it, but this might be the hardest difficulty setting in any Resident Evil game I have ever played. If you break out the broken weapons from the shop, I'm sure it's a lot easier, but playing on Inferno mode with standard weapons is a task that I will not be completing anytime soon. It should also be noted that Inferno mode turns off autosaves, forcing you to save your progress using typewriters. If you're looking for a challenge, RE3 has you covered, because Inferno mode is fucking brutal. Might go back and tackle it one day, but we'll see. I think that sums up my main problems with Resident Evil 3, but there are a few more things I want to go over. First of all, Jill in this game takes an unrealistic amount of punishment. I know that stars are supposed to be tough, but Jill takes a plunge off the roof of a parking garage, and later falls off a building that is way larger and brushes it off like it's nothing. Later on, Nemesis fires a rocket right next to Jill's feet, which only knocks her over the wall. I want to be clear, if this only happened once or twice, I would not care, but there are a handful of moments in this game where Jill should have been dead or critically injured, yet she walks it off just fine. Also, I said I wasn't going to talk about it, but fuck it, this point is worth repeating anyway. Nemesis should be allowed to enter safe rooms, especially on harder difficulties. I personally would love that change, but unfortunately it never came to be. Sure, there may have to be some workarounds, but still. I think it would have made Nemesis a lot better. I think that sums up my main complaints, but like I said at the beginning of this video, I have warmed up to this game a lot. The difficulty is certainly there, and Nemesis certainly had his moments to shine. Core gameplay is really good, and I did find myself having fun. The problem is everything after the city segment. The areas, the bosses, the enemies. Everything just gets more and more watered down the further you get into the game. If this game was just an hour longer with maybe one additional area, then it would be fine. But especially when compared to RE2 and RE4, this game just feels underwhelming. This game could have been so much better, and that's the worst part. The first 2 hours of this game give you flashes of what it could have been, but unfortunately the game almost completely derails itself after the city segment. Jill, and especially Nemesis, deserved better. This game had a lot of problems, but Nemesis is where they dropped the ball the hardest. Capcom had literally the perfect template with Mr. X from RE2, and yet they somehow still fucked it up. Capcom thankfully recovered a year later with the best remake of a game I've ever played, but with that said, the Resident Evil 3 remake is still one of the biggest wastes of an opportunity I've seen in a long time. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.